There we go. I want to situate where we are at this point and summarize a bit of what I've been saying the last several lectures. The relationship of the Muslim world faith community with Europe becomes a central concern for history after 1400. One might even argue a bit earlier than that. That concern takes two forms. One of them is a relationship that is played out geographically within a territory that I will, for shorthand, refer to as the world of Hellenistic inheritance. Basically, Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Might throw in the Persians or not, depending on how you feel. But this is a world where you had a shared cultural heritage that goes back to the pre-Islamic period, and a world in which there had been a very long history of tensions and often outright warfare between dominant societies at the eastern end of the Mediterranean and societies more toward the middle and western end of the Mediterranean. So to have a conflict between Europe and the Ottoman Empire in a way is sort of, repeating historical patterns that go back to Greece and Rome. And of course, there was a time when the Greeks were seemed to be way ahead of the Romans in many ways, and then a later time when the Romans appeared to be way ahead of the Greeks, who fell into a far more or less dynamic position than they had had back in classical times. The other relationship is between Europe and those Muslim societies that are not in the world of the Hellenistic inheritance. These are relationships with sub-Saharan Africa, both in the west and the east, relationships with India, relationships with Southeast Asia. The two other areas of substantial Muslim growth that have comparatively little European contact are China and until after 1600 Central Asia, which becomes into colonial relations or imperial relations with Russia after that time. So what I've been focusing on is the world of the Hellenistic inheritance and the question of the relative success or strength or power, wealth of the European portion as opposed to the Ottoman portion. This topic is dealt with by different scholars in different ways. For a long time it has been very common to ascribe the differences to cultural or religious differences. That is to say that Europe went through a Renaissance, a Reformation, and ultimately an Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, and that these were, studyable in different ways, but they were profoundly ideological, spiritual, and cultural developments. By contrast, the Islamic world of the Eastern Mediterranean, primarily the Ottoman Empire, was seen as being left behind, or alternatively, as undergoing a kind of cultural decline or ossification. These are the terms in which the literature tends to be written, either talking about Islamic decline or defending the Muslim world against charges of decline, talking about European success and ascribing it either to religious ideological motivations. For example, if you think of Max Weber's book on Protestantism and the rise of capitalism, the Protestant ethic and the rise of capitalism, that ascribes the economic success to changes in the religious sphere, and other people who ascribe that success to changes in an economic sphere. For example, after 1600, the beginning of joint stock companies. But I'm not a religious historian. I'm not a cultural historian. I'm not inclined to want to talk about those things. I'm a social historian and historian of technology. And what I have become most involved in thinking about is, are there aspects of social structure or of changes in the technology, in the material world, that offer explanations of the change in fates between the eastern and the western ends of the world of Hellenistic inheritance from 1300 onward. I've talked about some of these. I've talked about a demographic change where Europe grows and the Islamic world shrinks, that I associate with climate alterations, and primarily in the 11th and 12th centuries. I have talked about the relationship of this to the growth of milling, and particularly of water mills and windmills in Europe, that not only bring in a technological base that in the course of time becomes the main underpinning of industrialization, but also it brings into being a social class, namely the millers, who have, unlike the aristocracy, both technical expertise and a substantial degree of wealth, as opposed to the aristocracy, which has wealth but usually very little in the way of technical expertise. The presence of an aristocracy in Europe also affects the business of adopting wheeled transportation and adopting new weapons. The Ottomans were very much open to new military techniques, particularly in the Janissary Corps. They were pioneers in using gunpowder weapons with infantry. And they adopted many of the changes that came into being in the early 1400s in the context of the Hussite Wars in Bohemia between the followers of Jan Hus and the Catholic Church. And these involved wagons used to carry cannon. For the first time, you have cannon that are put on two wheels and become the prototype of what later will be field artillery, although they were initially in the 1420s pulled by oxen, not by horses. And you have the adoption of hand weapons. I point out that the words howitzer and pistol and coach all come out of the Bohemia, Hungary military frontier that is so prominent in the 1400s. The aristocracy also play a role in some things that are less apparent, but are important for that time. In I think, quite a wonderful study of the Black Death, Stuart Borsch has compared the impact of the Black Death of 1348 on Egypt and on England. By his calculations, the size of the economy of Egypt and England in what we would now call, GDP was about the same. The population in 1348 was about the same. The structure of landholding was strikingly similar, so that in England you had noblemen who held land, parcels of land, and they provided military and political allegiance to the king in return for those lands, and when a nobleman died, his successor had to pay a fee in order to continue holding the land. In Egypt, you had a similar situation insofar as the lands of Egypt were divided into iqtas, into land holdings, and those land holdings were assigned to individual Mamluk commanders, so that each Mamluk commander received the income from a parcel of land that was assigned to him, and he would pay for his personal expenses and for the expenses of his troops by using the tax revenues of those lands. The substantive difference between these two systems was that in England, the nobility usually lived on their land, while in Egypt, the Mamluk commanders normally lived in Cairo or in whatever garrison they were assigned to command. They did not live on their lands. They would have an agent who would superintend the lands, collect the taxes, and forward them on to the person who held the lands. The master registers of who had what land were kept in Cairo, and the Mamluk Sultan was capable of changing the tenure of the land pretty much at his disposition. In other words, you did not have much security of tenure, partly because, of course, the Mamluks did not have sons who went into the military profession, unlike the English nobles whose sons were almost all thought of themselves, at least, as becoming knightly members of the military profession. So you had a rapid, or at least a frequent, turnover of land title or land permit in Egypt, which you did not have in England. Now, when the Black Death came in 1348, one of the things that's been observed for a long time is that while the mortality of the Black Death was roughly the same in Egypt and England, pretty much throughout the lands where the Black Death raged as a pandemic, you had a mortality of somewhere between a third and a half of the population. If you look at, and this is 1348, 1349, if you look at England 50 years later, you find a very robust economy, a very dynamic recovery from the Black Death, and a change in the structure of the economy that is often seen as a precursor to some of the social changes that come to the fore in the Industrial Revolution. If you look at Egypt 50, 70 years after the Black Death, or 150 years after the Black Death, or 250 years after the Black Death, Egypt remains devastated. It's not just that there are occasional new episodes of plague, which there are, but then you have occasional new outbreaks of plague in Europe. There is something that makes England recover, and that prevents Egypt from recovering. Now, what Stuart Bush argues contrary to people who have said that this is basically a cultural, ideological, or religious difference. What he argues is that if you look at the specific histories of England and Egypt in response to the onset of the plague, you can see the reasons why you had different outcomes. He says that in both countries, as the rural labor force died off, there was a very acute perception of the negative economic impact of this loss of life. If you had fewer peasants to work the land, you would have a lower production. If you had a lower production, you would have lower taxes, tax returns. And the landowners, or the landholders, if they did not have freehold ownership, they would find their living resources substantially diminished. If you lose half your labor force, your take from agriculture is going to go down. So the result was, in both countries, the policy adopted at the central level, at the royal level, or at the level of the Sultan in Egypt, was the same. Force the peasants to stay on the land. Do not allow them to flee, because every peasant that flees is simply added to the number of peasants who die, from the point of view of being revenue-producing beings. So policies in both countries called for peasants to remain on the land, and called upon the nobility or the Mamluk commanders to enforce these policies, to actively prevent peasants from leaving the land. In England, this policy failed, largely because the lands being held in hereditary fashion, the people who were currently controlling the land were concerned about what would happen to their families, what would happen to the next generation, the next generations, if the land fell out of production. From their point of view, the reasonable thing to do was to steal labor from their neighbor. Instead of suppressing the flight of peasants, their idea was to encourage the flight of peasants, just not from their land. This meant, in many instances, essentially bribing peasants to leave. If you leave Lord so-and-so's land, village, and you come to my village, you'll get a better house. You'll get fewer labor obligations. You'll get a better financial return. So that the flight of peasants in England was not arrested. Not only did many of the peasants flee to neighboring landholdings, where the lords who were in residence encouraged this, but many of them fled to towns, where they were harder to locate or forced to go home, besides which nobody was forcing them. By contrast, in the Mamluk territories in Egypt, and Borsch does not talk about Syria, so we don't know whether Syria is in the same situation or not. But in the Mamluk territories in Egypt, the Mamluks mobilized to enforce the ruling of the central government. And you had Mamluk war parties that went out to the villages to force the peasants to stay on the land. Peasants still left the land because flight to many people seemed to be a good way to avoid contagion. But in Egypt, they were more likely to flee to the desert and become one with the nomads in the desert than to flee either to cities where enforcement mechanisms might force them to return, or to neighboring lands, because all of the Mamluk commanders living in Cairo saw a common interest, instead of trying to maximize their private interest. In England, this resulted in growing urban population, better nutrition because you had fewer people who had to be fed, diversifying agriculture, having more market agriculture so that lords who had lured peasants might be more inclined to grow crops for the urban market rather than the crops they had been growing. And you have a dynamic urban life by the early 1400s. Whereas in Egypt, the rural situation remains, incredibly desolate, and remains that way pretty much down to the end of the 1700s. The cities do not flourish. Cairo remains a big city, but other cities do not flourish. You do not have a growth of production. In fact, the most important export crop of Egypt, which is sugar, survives as a product, but it doesn't grow as a share of the economy. The other crop that is exported through Egypt from the 1400s on is coffee, but that's a transit crop. It's grown in Yemen and transported through Cairo to the Ottoman Empire or later to Europe. So this leads one to think that, well, maybe the difference is in social structure, and that the happenstance that landholding was similar but different in these two lands contributed to the relative resiliency and vitality of England and the decline relative to England of Egypt. So I talked about milling, I talked about demography, talked about the impact of the Black Death. I've talked about wheeled transport. This is not immediately terribly important because other than putting cannon on wheels, road transport remains fairly unimportant, or at least wheeled road transport remains fairly unimportant both in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire down to the 1700s. And by unimportant, what I mean is if you go to any museum and stroll through the galleries of European art, looking at art from the Renaissance on to pretty much the late 1700s, and you look at those landscapes and you say, there are no vehicles, there are no wagons, there are no carts, there are people walking, and there are pack animals, but you simply don't see any traffic. And then and frankly, this applies not just to landscapes, but to urban cityscapes as well, where you'll see a paved plaza and no wheeled vehicles on it. Conceivably, this is because artists didn't think that wheeled vehicles were very pretty, or because they didn't know how to draw them, found them difficult to draw. But in this same period, you have amazing artistic talent giving the details of ships, of almost any technical or natural subject matter. So I don't think there's an artistic bias against wheels. It's just that wheels weren't very common. And they weren't very common because they weren't very useful. Roads right down to 1700, or right down really to pretty much 1800, roads in Europe were unpassable most of the time because of mud, deep ruts, etc. At one point in the 1700s, the Holy Roman Emperor at that time took a trip from London to, I can't remember what the town was. It's a distance of 50 miles. this is the Holy Roman, the emperor. I mean, he's one of the really big guys. His carriage overturned 12 times in 50 miles. And people who traveled through the country in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s expected to break down. The wheels would come off, they would turn over, they'd get mired in mud. Many of them would travel with big bundles of straw to put in the mud and levers to wedge the vehicle out of the mud, and extra personnel who are riding along just to be available when you had the breakdown, because you were surely going to have a breakdown. So that the wheels that were adopted in the carriage revolution by the noblemen of Europe were used almost entirely for local display in towns for the next 200 years. So you'll find them in London or Amsterdam, but you won't find them in the countryside. A very different story arises when you look at seafaring. And this is a topic I want to get into because changes in both the design of ships and the armament of ships play a very prominent role in the differential history between the eastern and the western, or the southeastern and the northwestern segments of the world of Hellenistic inheritance. The person to read on this is a historian named John Gilmartin, who has written a book. He's written two books. One's called Gunpowder and Galleys. The other is called, I think, Galleons and Galleys. I think he probably could have done better with that, but nevertheless. He's a military officer by training. And he starts in Gunpowders and Galleys by talking about the theory behind the idea of naval supremacy. How is naval warfare conducted? He says that since the late 19th century, Admiral Mahon wrote a great book on sea power, and other theorists had a certain vision of naval supremacy that worked in the 19th century and worked in the 20th century. In this vision, you would have seaports that were used for importing and exporting goods to combatant nations. If you could blockade those seaports, you had the potential of either starving the combatant nation or preventing it exporting goods that it earned money from. Now, to maintain a blockade in this system meant that you had to do two things. First, you had to reduce the capability of the other side from breaking out. In other words, the vision here was that you would have a fleet engagement where you get all of my boats and all your boats, go up against each other and go boom, 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 and see who gets to sink whom. But you also had a theory of avoiding fleet engagement, so that a so-called fleet in being, one that has not gone to war but could go to war when your back is turned and break through a blockade, that became an alternate strategy. So you'd say, your ships are stronger than my ships, but I'm going to keep my ships holed up here in a safe harbor, and you'll never know when I'm going to break out. So you'll have to deploy many of your ships simply to guard against the possibility of my breaking out. Otherwise, the blockading ships, if once they had reduced the resistance of the enemy, the blockading ships could just sail back and forth in front of the mouth of a harbor, and nobody could go in or out of the harbor without being challenged and very possibly sunk by this blockading vessel. This theory of fleet engagements plus blockade had been around for a long time. And what Gilmartin argues is that it doesn't work when you go back to the period of Ottoman European conflict in the Mediterranean in particular, but also in the Red Sea and in somewhat marginal ways in the Atlantic Ocean. He says that what you had then were not sailing ships or much later steam-powered ships. What you had then were galleys. And a galley is rowed by oarsmen rather than under sail. It is a comparatively small vessel and with a comparatively large number of oarsmen, so that the muscle power can propel it at a fairly rapid pace, particularly if you're actually in an engagement and your notion of how to win is to ram the other person's galley or the other person's sailing ship. You want to get into the right position and then row like mad at a really high rate to build up the momentum that allows the beak of your galley to penetrate the hull of the other ship. And then as it starts to sink, you leap out of your galley into their ship and kill everybody. This was a theory of galley warfare. Now, the drawback of galley warfare that Gilmartin was the first to write about, at least among the historians I'm aware of, the drawback of this was that if you have a lot of men in a fairly small vessel, you run out of drinking water very fast. And if they are working their tails off, rowing, they need the water even more. And if they're in a hot climate, let's say a Mediterranean summer, they need the water even more. So that the length of time that a galley can remain at sea is very, very limited. They run out of water. And water is very heavy to carry aboard ship. So you could not have ships sailing back and forth in front of the mouth of a harbor and blockading the harbor because they weren't sailing. They were rowing, and they could only stay at sea for a matter of a day or so. They couldn't hold position at the mouth of a harbor in the way a fully rigged sailing ship could. So the result was that you had a premium put not on blockading, but on capturing strong points on shore that would be next to a harbor, and then using those strong points as a protection for your galleys that you pulled up on the beach. When you saw, if you wanted to run a blockade, when you saw a ship coming, you ran down to your galley and you pushed off, and you went out and you intercepted the trading ship. But you could only do this if you had a base on the shore. So this led to a great emphasis, not simply on the strength of the harbor. Very often harbors would be closed by a chain, so you could not go into a foreign harbor unless you could get them to lower the chain or break the chain. But you had the idea of capturing land next to the harbor, building a little castle, and drawing your galleys up there. You're still trying to blockade, but it's much harder to blockade. And we don't have any really successful blockades before about 1600. When you build that little castle on the shore, the way you protect your ships after 1400 is by putting cannon in the castle. So that there was a rationale for cannon use other than using in sieges. In a siege, you use a cannon against the wall of a city that you're trying to capture. But here you have smaller cannon, and they're used to shoot at any foreign boat that comes and threatens your galleys. After all, if your enemy can land on the shore and burn your galleys, now you've lost your strong point. So you had a growth of coastal fortifications. And those coastal fortifications were pretty effective. But there's a question of, do you put a gun in the boat itself? I mean, ultimately, what you're going to get, as you know, anyone who watches movies about Jack Sparrow and you know how warfare is really conducted, what you're ultimately going to get are ships that have lines of cannon that shoot through gun ports in the side and blow up the enemy's ship. This was a vision that never was as successful in reality as it is in Hollywood. During the American Revolution, the Serapis and the Bonhomme Richard fought each other at a distance of about from here to the end of the room all day long, and neither was able to sink the other, because it's hard to sink a ship with a cannonball. Particularly, you can take down the mast, you can make it unsteerable, but actually getting it to sink was fairly hard. So that galleys did not visualize using cannon to sink somebody else's vessel. They also did not want to put heavy bronze cannon in a ship where that would take up some of the carrying capacity that you could devote to drinking water. So typically in a galley, you would have the oars coming out here, and then you would have something like an old TV antenna up in the front, and you'd have a small cannon mounted on it, usually several of them. Be sort of like a Christmas tree of cannon, aimed straight forward. And what they were used for was that as you were rowing to contact the foreign vessel, as you were about to make contact, you fired all of your cannon and blew away whoever was defending the other vessel right at the point of contact, so that when you jumped across in order to seize the other vessel, you'd be jumping across after this explosion had killed or scared or maimed most of your enemy. The idea of shooting at a distance made no sense as Gilmartin reconstructs it in terms of galley warfare, because the time, and you can calculate this, how long did it take to reload a cannon? And his argument is that when you made that last dash to build up momentum and close with the enemy, maybe you were rowing at 35 strokes a minute for a minute or 45 seconds, but you didn't have enough time to reload the cannon. So there was no point firing from a distance. You'd probably miss anyway, because you didn't have time to reload before you closed with the enemy. The result was that galleys had cannon that were very small. And they were tactically the appropriate cannons to have for that, for that type of warfare. Now, the European ships, the Christian ships, that they were fighting against in the sea battles of the Ottoman Empire. There were many of these sea battles because the Ottoman Empire in Venice, the Ottoman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire were enemies for several hundred years. The Christian ships were descended in part from cargo ships, which were called cogs, medieval cargo ship. It traveled with a sail, not with oarsmen. It was a very tubby sort of ship. In other words, it's about twice as long as it was wide. Sort of a big, just a chubby cargo ship. It would hold a lot, but it was very hard to maneuver. It had very little military capacity. So the military idea was to design ships that would be effective in military terms, but did not require constant visiting of shore fortifications, particularly in areas where the Ottomans held the shore, which by 1520 included pretty much everything from Morocco across the southern Mediterranean, up the eastern Mediterranean, and up to the Aegean and the Adriatic Seas. The Ottomans held the coast, so the Europeans fought at sea. Now their strategies were different. Ultimately, their strategies led to the development of shipboard cannon. But this was a slow process. Initially, in a caravel, which was sort of like this. It had a large forecastle or forecastle. It had a large stern castle, rudder coming out over here. It was quite tall. A galley obviously had to be close to the water, because the farther you are from the water, the longer the oars have to be, and the harder the oars are to manipulate. It's just simple mechanical leverage. Galleys are built, low to the water, whereas these boats that carried many fewer people were built much higher. Partly this is because some of them have heritages from the Atlantic Ocean where the waves are higher, but it also had to do with military strategy. Their idea was that as they would approach a galley, they would drop a grappling hook from the forecastle onto the other person's ship, and they would reel it in and board it. They tried to make use of their height. So when we see the first of these caravels being used in the early 1400s, they don't have much in the way of cannon. The cannon they have tend to be located facing forward, but not facing forward from the forecastle. They face forward from the stern castle because that has more room. And so they have to face forward at an angle so they don't shoot themselves. Occasionally, you'll find a cannon in midships, but there's every indication that the cannon that they used in the early 1400s were meant defensively, and that their offensive technique was to board, to grapple and board, rather than ram and board, which was the galley technique. It's often said that the European ships being designed for the Atlantic were much more effective and could develop more military potential than the galleys that you had in the Ottoman Empire, which were primarily in narrow waters like the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean in particular, and the Red Sea. But in fact, the matter is that when the Portuguese got to the Red Sea, they started to use galleys in addition to their sailing ships. I mean, the difference in quality was not that clear in the 1400s. So there is a military technology on shipboard that has a differential that's somewhat similar to that on the ground. Both sides had guns. Both sides were rather slow in deciding what the optimum use of the guns was. One of the problems is that if you wanted to shoot a hole in the side of your enemy with a cannon, you had to shoot from low. You had to be down where the enemy was, which meant you had your cannon shooting out here. Well, this is a problem because if you have, no matter how tall your ship is, if you have an open window on the side just above the water line, you have a big problem because any wave comes and water comes through the window. So one of the things that is slow to develop is waterproof shutters. Only with waterproof shutters could they lower the cannon down into the hull of the ship. Now, this tug of war between naval technology in the Mediterranean, what the Ottomans did and what the Europeans did, seems really to be kind of a history of naval warfare at this time. And it's a slow back and forth development that ultimately the galleys lose and the ships that can have lots of cannon win. Although galleys are still being used certainly in the early 19th century. So it's not as though the galley becomes obsolete for a long time. What world historians point to, and most people don't pay much attention to, is that at exactly the same time, between 1404 and 1433, the most sophisticated ships in the world are being made in China. This is the time when the Chinese Admiral Zheng He is making 7 naval expeditions from China down into Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, to East Africa, at least in his 6th and 7th voyages. And there's a report that he went to Mecca, which may or may not be true. He was, however, a Muslim. His birth name was not Zheng He. His family name was Ma. And Ma is a very common, the most common surname among Chinese Muslims. It's thought to be short for Muhammad. Sort of, Mo. So he might have gone to Mecca. He certainly went to East Africa. Some people claim he went up around the Horn of Africa and up into the Atlantic Ocean. That's harder to establish from the documentation we have. But what's most impressive is the ships that he had with him. And this is a fleet of many ships. His largest ships, well, imagine a football field. His largest ships filled a football field. They were about 50 yards wide and 120 yards long. That's the football field plus the area of the end zone. And so you think of a football field, one ship filling the entire thing. The Santa Maria of Columbus, which is the biggest of his 3 vessels, would have reached the 20-yard line. That's how much bigger the Chinese ships were. So while there's a tremendous amount of literature on the evolution of naval expertise in the European theater, you have something entirely different going on in China, commanded by a Muslim. And a Muslim who is visiting Java, where Islam is beginning to penetrate, India, where Islam is certainly well established from 1100 onward, East Africa, places like Mogadishu and Mombasa, where Islam is well established. So you wonder about what people thought of these enormous ships. As I say, this is something world historians focus on. Regrettably, many of them focus on it because there's a story that from one of his voyages, Zheng He brought back a giraffe. And I found that every world history textbook mentions the giraffe. And my own textbook, up until a recent edition, mentioned it in 2 separate chapters. And I purged it of that. I think I got rid of the giraffe entirely. I thought getting a polar bear to Baghdad in the 1100s was cooler than a giraffe to China, but no accounting for taste. So this was a different area, and it gets into an interesting, although peripheral, history of the history of sailing vessels and ship design and so forth, in which, when you get into it, you discover that you have dramatically different technological universes. That what you have in the East China Sea and on the rivers of China are sailing traditions that never really spread much farther, but they are the state of the art. They had compartmentalized hulls, so if you knocked a hole in the side or hit a reef, it wouldn't sink because only that one compartment would flood. They had stern-mounted rudders, whereas in other parts of the world they were putting an oar over the side to steer. They had sails made out of bamboo products that were very different from the linen sails that you had elsewhere. Then you have another sailing realm, which is basically the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean from Africa across to Indonesia. Probably the sail was invented in Southeast Asia originally, if you go back far enough in time. And the sails that they devised there originally, the reconstruction of sail history, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I think it's kind of interesting. You have a boat, and so it's like that. So on one side of the boat you put up a stick, other side of the boat you put up a stick, and then you put a piece of cloth between it, and there you have a sail. That probably is the earliest type. Then it was found if you have 2 sticks up like that, and going down to a single ship you bury in the hull of the boat, then you put your thing across there, and it's, that's an easier type of sail to have. The problem is that as you get wider toward the top, the wind takes more from the top, and so you're less steady. So the way to deal with that is that you take the whole thing and you tip it. So then you have a sail there that's triangular with a small part at the top and a larger part farther down. So that the history of the triangular sail seems to come out of Indonesia and Polynesia and to spread across the Indian Ocean. And that is what is called a lateen sail, and was very different from the square sails that they had on the Nile River in Egyptian times, and that were then inherited into Greco-Roman antiquity, where you would normally have simply a mast and a square sail on the mast. So you have different sail traditions in the Indian Ocean. Also, they, not in China, but in the Indian Ocean tradition, they would take, for the boards that made up the side of the ship, they would drill holes on the edges of the boards and then tie the boards together. So that basically they're sometimes referred to as sewing the hull together. And then the crack between the boards would be coated with bitumen, which arises on the surface in the Persian Gulf, where we now have the oil fields. And so you would put tar along there to make it watertight. So sewn hulls were used in the Indian Ocean, in European waters, whether the Atlantic or the North Sea or the Mediterranean. They used nails, and yet they also had different designs. You could either have the boards butt up against each other, or you could have them overlap. You could either build a frame and then nail the boards to the frame, or you could build it up in the shape you wanted from the start. Many different alternatives of how to build boats, but you had nailed boats in the west and sewn boats in the south. The problem with nailed boats, of course, is that if the nails were iron, they would rust, and then they would be done. Bronze did not corrode as badly, but of course, bronze nails are also more expensive. Ultimately, the development of ships in the eastern waters reaches levels that are not really quite paralleled in the European Ottoman theater. In the 1500s, there was a war between Korea and Japan, in which the Korean admiral wins something like 33 consecutive fleet engagements, never loses a battle. On land, the Koreans are beaten every single time, but at sea, the Koreans win every battle, and he dies after the last battle. So he was never defeated. And Admiral Yi, one of the great naval heroes of history, and his signal contribution was to put roofs on his deck, and then have apparently metal projections so that nobody could jump onto the roof without, skewering themselves on a sword blade or something. And these were called as turtle boats because they had this hard top. And he won, I think, one engagement where he had 13 ships against 300. He still won. Interestingly, no one ever has included him in a world history until recently. And largely it's because now that Korea is becoming a rich country in the world, it wants a bigger share of world history. If you're in the world history trade, you discover that there's a certain relationship between GDP today and number of pages or paragraphs you get in a world history. Leaving that aside, in the Ottoman European case, you have technical developments in armaments, technical developments at sea. You have social structural changes having to do with the presence of a landed aristocracy in Europe and the use of land grants that can be canceled at will in the Ottoman case. It's pretty much a standoff up until the middle of the 1500s. Then there is a development that, again, Gil Martin is best at talking about it. This has to do with handheld guns. As the handheld guns became more effective, they could reload them faster, they could shoot farther, they could aim them better. Though in Europe, at least, you don't have a handheld guns being, deciding a battlefield engagement until a battle between the Spaniards and the French in, I think, 1503, where the side that has guns wins. But otherwise, up until that point, the handheld guns are not a decisive battlefield phenomenon. But in the 1500s, they become lighter, they become more effective, and for the Ottoman Empire, that means that they need to have more people firing guns, and to have more people firing guns, it means they have to have more janissaries, because they're the section of the army devoted to it. The guns are still too heavy to be carried on horseback. So the horsemen, who are called sipahis, remain armed with bows and arrows and spears, but the ratio changes. So you have a rapid increase in the number of janissaries in the 1500s and a decrease in the number of sipahis. The decrease in the number of sipahis, unlike increasing the number of janissaries, involved land. Every sipahi had a land grant that paid for his expenses and for the expenses of the equipment he needed on a campaign and any subordinate soldiers whom he was expected to bring to the campaign. Basically, what would happen was that in the late winter, word would go out from Istanbul to all of the sipahis living in the countryside that they were to assemble on a specific date, a specific place, and be prepared to spend the summer waging war. The waging of war would come to an end around the end of September, and then they would go back to their land, and they would live on their lands September through, let's say, April, and they would basically be the administrators of their lands, sort of like an English lord. And they could usually pass on the land holding to a son if the son was of a military capability and disposition. So the sipahis are quite like the lower ranks of the nobility in Europe, but they can't be equipped with gunpowder weapons. The janissaries are different. They're brought in, as I've mentioned before, through the devshirme, through the draft put on primarily Balkan communities over a period of several hundred years. They are Christians by origin, almost all of them. They are converted to Islam, given a certain degree of education. The most outstanding ones go to the palace school, where they train to become military commanders or heads of government bureaus. But the main thing is that since they live in barracks 12 months of the year, they have to be fed 12 months of the year. With the sipahis, they get their own food during the parts of the year when they are living at home, and then they're expected to pay for their provisions when they go on campaign. So the cost to the central treasury of a janissary is way more than the cost to the central treasury of a sipahi. Now, when you have a very large proportion of all the land of the empire being going to land assignments for your cavalry, the only way you can get the money to pay the rising number of janissaries, or one of the few ways you can get the money, is to throw the Sipahis off the land and bring the land under central administration. So one of the things that happens toward the end of the 1500s is that you start to have dispossessed Sipahis. As many governments have learned to their parallel, it's not good to have disgruntled former army officers with nothing to do. So these dispossessed guys were unhappy. Now the reason that they were dispossessed is not simply that they needed more money in the central treasury, but there was all sorts of financial disruption going on at this time. Financial disruption in the 1500s is usually thought of as having one primary source, and that is a flood of silver coming in from Mexico and Peru, primarily into Spain. The Ottoman Empire, like the Safavid Empire to the east of it, did not have much in the way of completely controlled sources of silver. So what would happen was that silver went down in value in Europe, but maintained a high value in the Ottoman Empire. The basic coin of the Ottoman Empire was called an akçe, which literally means the little white one, because it was a little silver coin. But they didn't have enough silver. So in order to maintain the currency, they started to put other metals in. So the akçe becomes more and more debased. And the Europeans are showing up to trade with really good silver coins. You know, some instances where whole shiploads of coins were being brought in by Europeans. And they would buy up everything in the bazaar. They'd say, oh, I'll take 12 of those and 35 of those and, you know, a lot of those, and here, take all this silver. We don't need, well, of course, to the Ottomans, that silver was precious because they didn't have a sound currency. The result was that you had bans on exports because the Ottoman Empire didn't want to lose all of its production to cheap silver. But you also had an inflation of prices because the merchants would say, well, you know, I'll sell you 12 of these for 35 of your silver coins, and then the next day they'd say, well, I'll sell you for 150 of the silver coins. Well, the Europeans could pay, they had the coins. So you had a price inflation. The price inflation meant that the Sipahis who were living on the land out in the countryside couldn't sell their crops at the old prices they had. It led to a terrible situation where you had declining revenues in the countryside. And this made it difficult for the Sipahis to supply themselves for the military campaign. If they didn't show up on time, they lost their land. So the price inflation, anyone who was on a fixed income essentially was impoverished by inflation, as it would happen now. Among the people impoverished by inflation, you had graduate students in the madrasas, and we have reports of gangs of students in student clothing beating up people on the highway and stealing their purses because their fellowships weren't large enough. You also had you had a whole bunch of converging problems that led to a great deal of rural unrest in the late 1500s and a flight of population from rural lands, particularly in Anatolia, to other parts of the empire, particularly in Europe. So you're increasing your military the expensive part of your military, the Janissaries, and you are decreasing the cavalry part, which is becoming impoverished because of economic changes. Another source of money to maintain the Janissaries that arises by the late 1500s is the idea that, well, maybe they can earn some money because, you know, if they're just in the barracks all year long, you know, eating soup and playing backgammon and occasionally, you know, training or something, maybe they could do something more useful. So toward the end of the 1500s, they gained permission to hold jobs. And that proves over the subsequent 2 centuries to be very problematic for the empire. When the Janissaries were set up, there was a tradition established according to which the only person to whom a Janissary owed obedience was the commander of the Janissaries, the Janissary or Aga. So if a Janissary, let's say, went into the shoe business, his authority in the shoe business was the commander of the Janissaries. It was not the head of the shoe guild. The Ottoman Empire, at an industrial level in the 14 and 1500s, and even later, was dominated by guilds. Guilds were predicated on the idea that every shop producing the same product was entitled to some degree of custom. It was not a completely competitive situation. So you wanted to limit production to the size of the market instead of having a competition in which some producers would win more of the market than others. And this went along with the idea of having all of the vendors of the same product be located right next to each other in the market. The way this was maintained was that the guild would collectively limit the number of masters you could have in the guild and guarantee that they all had raw materials to work with. And they would stipulate prices. So you basically had a price-controlled system dominated by the masters of the market. If a Janissary went into the shoe business, he could break the price line because he was only responsible to his commander, not to the guild. So the Janissaries could undercut other people on price, or they could offer more for raw materials. So Janissaries going into business was questionable, but it also made it desirable for many people to be in the Janissary Corps. And so you had people who were trying to get into the Janissary Corps, not so they could fight, but so they could pursue business. Now this doesn't mean the Janissaries became cobblers. This meant that a Janissary who wanted to go in the shoe business would find a cobbler who would set up a shop under the protection of the Janissary. And then the Janissary would take the profit on the shop. So even as the Janissary numbers are growing, the work effort of the Janissaries is becoming spread over not simply military affairs, but over business affairs. So that ultimately, by 1800, if the Janissaries are called to fight, they go out and hire soldiers rather than fight themselves, because they become primarily an economic interest group. But that is still in the future in the 1500s. And the Janissary numbers are increasing. By the second quarter of the 1600s, the devshirman is no longer selecting boys for the Janissaries because they have enough people who want into the Janissary Corps or who are the sons of Janissaries to fill the slots that are available. The result is that while you had technological moves in the Ottoman Empire that were really fairly sophisticated and more or less kept pace, although somewhat different in different areas, with what was going on elsewhere in Europe. You had a social structural disorder that, in a number of ways, reduced the effectiveness of the Ottoman economy. And that sounds like a really good place to stop, because we have come to the end of time, and while I could keep you against your will for another 5 minutes, I think I will not.